Sometimes power reveals itself in silence, right after the world thinks you have none. The sound came first, a sharp rip that cut through the calm afternoon air like something that didn't belong, not in a place filled with children's laughter and the distant hum of ice cream trucks rolling past in the summer heat, not in a park where sunlight filtered gently through tall oak trees and families spread blankets across freshly cut grass. But it happened anyway, sudden and jarring, turning heads, freezing conversations, pulling attention toward a single moment that no one had expected and no one could ignore. And at the center of it stood Angela Brooks, perfectly still, her breath steady, her posture unbroken, as if the world around her had slowed down while everyone else struggled to catch up with what they had just witnessed. Because she didn't react the way people thought she would. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She didn't even step back. She simply stood there with a calm that didn't match the tension building in the air, her eyes lifting slowly to meet the officer in front of her, Officer Ryan Cole, whose expression carried the weight of certainty, the kind that comes from never being questioned, never being challenged, the kind that turns assumption into authority without hesitation. And in his mind this was routine, just another stop, just another situation handled the way he believed it should be handled, his voice firm, clipped, filled with that quiet edge of judgment that didn't need to be loud to be felt, as if he had already decided who she was the moment he saw her walking through the park alone, as if her presence itself required explanation, and around them the crowd began to form, not all at once, but gradually, like a ripple spreading outward, people slowing their steps, turning their heads, raising their phones, curiosity blending with discomfort, because something about the scene didn't sit right. Something about the stillness of the woman and the confidence of the officer created a tension that no one could quite explain, and yet no one stepped forward, not yet, because moments like this often lived in that fragile space between action and hesitation, where people watched and waited, unsure of where the line truly was, and Angela remained exactly where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides, her voice quiet when she finally spoke, steady in a way that didn't match the situation unfolding around her. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she said, not with fear, not with anger, but with a certainty that seemed almost out of place, and for a split second, barely noticeable, something flickered across Ryan's face, not doubt exactly, but the faintest disruption in his rhythm, like a note slightly off in a song he had played too many times before, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same rigid confidence as before. Because in his world, moments like this didn't turn, they didn't shift, they didn't challenge him, they followed a script, and he believed he was still in control of it. Even as the air around them began to change in ways he couldn't yet see, even as the silence from Angela carried more weight than any protest ever could, even as somewhere just beyond the edge of the scene, something unseen was already moving closer. The murmurs started low, barely more than a whisper carried on the warm breeze. But they spread quickly, weaving through the small crowd like an invisible current as more people slowed down, their attention pulled toward the tension that refused to break. Because there was something unsettling about the way Angela stood there, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, as if she understood something the rest of them did not. And that quiet composure began to shift the atmosphere in ways no one could quite name. While Officer Ryan Cole adjusted his stance, his shoulders squared, his voice growing sharper, louder now, not because the situation demanded it, but because something inside him did, something that needed control to remain intact. "I asked you a simple question," he said, each word clipped and deliberate, as if repetition alone could reinforce his authority. But Angela did not match his tone. She did not raise her voice to meet his. Instead she spoke again, calm and even. "And I gave you a simple answer." And that contrast hung in the air, heavy, noticeable, because it did not follow the script people expected. It did not escalate the way these moments usually did, and that alone made it harder for him to proceed without pushing further, without doubling down, as if the only way forward was through more force, more insistence, more certainty. And around them phones were now clearly visible, held chest high, angled carefully, capturing everything. Because in a world where moments like this could vanish without proof, people had learned to record first and process later, and somewhere behind the crowd a voice spoke up, hesitant at first, She said she did not do anything. But it was quiet, almost swallowed by the tension, and Ryan ignored it, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging doubt. And doubt was not something he allowed into moments like this, not when he had already decided how it should end. Yet the environment no longer felt as stable as it had just minutes ago, the easy confidence he carried beginning to press against something unseen, something subtle but growing, like pressure building beneath the surface, and Angela felt it too, not as fear, not as urgency, but as a shift, a quiet turning of the moment that did not need to be forced. Because she had seen this before, not the exact situation, not this park or this officer, but the pattern, the way assumptions formed, the way authority moved when it believed it would not be challenged. And she knew that reacting emotionally would only feed it, would only give it exactly what it expected. So she remained still, her breathing steady, her gaze unwavering, even as the weight of the crowd settled around her, even as the situation stretched longer than it should have. And then, almost unnoticed at first, a faint vibration came from her phone resting in her hand, a small detail, easy to miss, but her eyes flicked downward for just a fraction of a second before returning to Ryan, and something in that tiny movement felt different, not urgent, not panicked, but intentional, as if it confirmed something rather than interrupted it. And in the distance, beyond the line of trees and parked cars, a dark vehicle slowed slightly before continuing forward, blending into the ordinary rhythm of the street, unnoticed by most, but not entirely unseen, because one man near the back of the crowd narrowed his eyes, his attention shifting away from the confrontation for just a moment, sensing that something larger was beginning to unfold, something that had not yet revealed itself. And back at the center of it all, Ryan took a step closer, his voice firm again, louder now, as if trying to reclaim the space that was quietly slipping from his control. "You are not leaving until I say you can," he said, and for the first time, Angela tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the moment had finally reached the point she had been waiting for, as if everything unfolding around them was exactly where it needed to be, even if no one else could see it yet. The air shifted in a way that no one could explain, not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, like the moment before a storm changes direction. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Officer Ryan Cole felt it, not as fear, not yet, but as a slight disruption in the rhythm he had been controlling so confidently just moments before, because the crowd was no longer just watching, it was thinking. And thinking led to doubt. And doubt was dangerous in situations built on certainty. And Angela Brooks stood at the center of it all, unchanged, her posture still composed, her expression steady. But there was something else now, something beneath the surface that had not been visible before, not power in the way people usually recognized it, not loud or forceful, but grounded, anchored, as if she was not reacting to the moment because she was not defined by it. And that realization began to spread quietly through the people watching, because humans recognize imbalance even when they cannot explain it. And what they were seeing no longer felt like authority being exercised. It felt like something being tested, something being pushed too far without understanding the cost. And Ryan spoke again. But this time his voice carried a sharper edge, less controlled than before. "You are refusing to cooperate," he said, and the statement hung there. But it did not land the same way it would have earlier, because Angela did not interrupt him, did not argue. She simply responded with a calm that seemed to absorb the tension instead of feeding it. "I am cooperating, officer. I am just not agreeing with you." And that distinction, small as it was, shifted the ground beneath his feet, because it challenged the assumption that compliance meant submission. And for a fraction of a second, Ryan hesitated, barely noticeable, but enough for the crowd to feel it. Enough for the moment to stretch in a new direction. And somewhere behind the front line of onlookers, a man lowered his phone slightly, his attention drawn not just to what was happening, but to how it was unfolding, the pattern, the imbalance, the quiet resistance that did not escalate, but did not yield either. And at that exact moment, the faint vibration from Angela's phone came again, longer this time, more deliberate. And though she did not reach for it immediately, the presence of that call seemed to exist in the space between them, like an unseen signal that something outside of this moment was already responding, already aware, and Ryan noticed it too. his eyes flicking briefly toward her hand before returning to her face. And something in that glance betrayed the first real crack in his certainty. Because situations like this were supposed to be contained, controlled, limited to what he could see and manage. But that small interruption suggested otherwise. Suggested connection, suggested reach, and that was not something he had accounted for. And in the distance, the same dark vehicle that had passed earlier slowed again, this time more noticeably. Its movement deliberate but not urgent, blending into the flow of traffic while still carrying a presence that did not belong to coincidence. And one of the bystanders, a woman standing near the edge of the crowd, turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she followed its path, sensing something she could not yet name. While back at the center, Ryan stepped closer. Again, but this time the step felt different, less grounded, more reactive, as if he was trying to regain control rather than exercise it. "You think you can just stand here and tell me how this works?" he said, and Angela met his gaze without hesitation, her voice soft but unwavering. "No, officer, I am standing here because I know exactly how this works." And that sentence did not rise in volume. It did not demand attention, but it carried weight, the kind that settled into the space and refused to move, the kind that made people pause, made them reconsider what they thought they were seeing. And for the first time, Ryan did not immediately respond, because something about the way she said it, the certainty, the calm, the absence of fear, did not fit the narrative he had built in his mind. And in that silence, brief but powerful, the balance of the moment shifted just enough that it could no longer be ignored, just enough that even he could feel it, even if he did not yet understand it. And as the seconds stretched, the unseen presence approaching from beyond the park grew closer, steady, inevitable, like a truth that had already been set in motion long before anyone realized it was coming. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the park like a held breath that no one wanted to release, because something had shifted in a way that could no longer be dismissed as routine. And Officer Ryan Cole felt it more clearly now, not just in the eyes of the crowd, but in the weight of the moment itself, the way it no longer moved at his command, the way it resisted him without force, without noise, simply by refusing to follow the path he expected. And Angela Brooks remained exactly where she was, her presence steady, grounded, as if the tension surrounding her could not penetrate whatever certainty she carried within. And that certainty began to feel visible, not through action but through contrast, because the more Ryan pressed, the more it exposed the imbalance between them, the difference between control and composure, between authority and restraint. And somewhere behind the line of onlookers, a child's laughter faded as parents gently pulled their children closer, not out of fear exactly, but out of instinct. Because the atmosphere had changed, it no longer felt like a normal afternoon. It felt like something important was about to happen, something that would not easily be forgotten. And Ryan cleared his throat, a small, involuntary action that betrayed the tension building beneath his surface, his voice returning again, but this time carrying a strain that had not been there before. "Last chance," he said, though the words felt less like a command and more like an attempt to reclaim a position that was already slipping. And Angela tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost measured in a way that made people lean in without realizing it. "You keep saying that," she replied, "but you have not asked the right question yet." And that sentence landed differently than anything else she had said, not because it was louder, but because it introduced something new, something that did not fit into Ryan's expectation of how this interaction should unfold. And for a moment he did not respond, because he did not have an immediate answer. And that pause, brief but undeniable, rippled through the crowd, because authority rarely paused. It moved forward, it asserted itself, but here it hesitated, and hesitation created space. And in that space, doubt began to grow. And then, from beyond the edge of the park, the low hum of an engine became more distinct, not loud, not disruptive, but deliberate. And a black SUV rolled slowly into view along the curb, its movement controlled, purposeful, as if it knew exactly where it was going before anyone else realized it had arrived. And one by one, heads turned, not all at once, but in a gradual wave, attention shifting away from the confrontation and toward the presence that had just entered the scene, because it carried something different, something that did not belong to coincidence, and Ryan noticed it too. His eyes flicking briefly past Angela, his focus breaking for just a second, and that second was enough. Enough for the balance to tilt further, enough for the moment to move beyond his control entirely. And Angela saw it happen, saw the shift in his attention, saw the first real sign that the situation was no longer contained within his understanding, and still she did not move, did not react, because she did not need to. Because whatever was coming was not something she had to summon, it was something that had already been set in motion long before this moment began. And the SUV came to a smooth stop, its engine idling quietly, the door remaining closed for just a heartbeat longer than expected, as if allowing the anticipation to settle, as if giving the moment time to fully form before revealing what came next. And the crowd grew quieter, not because they were told to, but because something about the scene demanded it, something about the way everything had aligned pointed toward an outcome that no one could yet see but everyone could feel. And Ryan shifted his weight again, his stance no longer as firm as before, his voice no longer rising, because now there was something else in the air, something unfamiliar, something he could not command. And as the SUV door finally began to open, the moment that had been building since the first second of tension reached its edge, not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet inevitability that could not be stopped. The door did not swing open quickly. It moved with a controlled, almost deliberate pace, as if whoever was inside understood that the moment had already arrived and there was no need to rush it. And when the first foot touched the pavement, polished shoes meeting the concrete path beside the park, the shift in the atmosphere became undeniable, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute. The kind of presence that did not demand attention because it naturally drew it, and the man who stepped out carried himself with a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with everything that had unfolded just moments before, his posture straight, his expression composed, his eyes scanning the scene with a focus that did not miss anything, not the crowd, not the raised phones, not the officer standing in front of Angela Brooks, and certainly not Angela herself. And for a brief second, just a fraction of a second, the calm in Angela's face softened, not into relief, not into fear, but into recognition, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what comes next. And the crowd felt it too, even if they did not understand it, because the energy had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Conversation stopped entirely now, phones held steadier, breaths quieter, as the man took a few measured steps forward, each one unhurried, each one carrying the weight of certainty. And behind him, another individual stepped out from the vehicle, dressed in a dark suit, his presence more reserved but equally alert, his eyes already scanning, already assessing, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it ever happened. And Officer Ryan Cole turned fully now, his attention no longer fixed on Angela, but pulled toward the new arrival. And for the first time since the confrontation began, his stance faltered, not dramatically, not enough for him to step back, but enough for the shift to be seen. Enough for the confidence he had carried to no longer feel complete, because authority recognizes authority, even when it does not want to, even when it tries to hold its ground. And the man approached until he stood just a few feet away, close enough that his presence filled the space between them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not raised. It did not carry anger. It did not need to. It was calm, measured, precise. The kind of voice that did not ask for attention because it expected to be heard. "Officer," he said, a single word that seemed to settle over the scene, not as a challenge, but as a statement. And Ryan swallowed, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before responding. "Sir, this is an active situation." But even as he said it, the words lacked the certainty they would have held just minutes ago, because something about the man standing in front of him did not fit into the category of bystander, did not fit into the pattern he had been following. And the man's gaze shifted briefly, just long enough to meet Angela's eyes. And in that exchange, silent and brief, everything was confirmed without a single word needing to be spoken. And when his attention returned to Ryan, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only clarity. "I can see that," he replied, his tone unchanged. "And I can also see that it has gone far enough." And that sentence, simple as it was, carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it did not argue. It concluded, and Ryan opened his mouth as if to respond, as if to explain, to justify, to regain control of the situation he had started, but the words did not come as easily now, because the ground beneath him had shifted completely, and around them, the crowd leaned in, not physically, but emotionally, drawn into the moment as it reached a turning point that could not be undone, and Angela remained still, her presence unchanged. But now, for the first time, it was clear to everyone watching that she had never been the one out of place, that the imbalance they had felt from the beginning was not coming from her, but from the assumptions placed upon her. And as the seconds stretched, the reality of the moment settled in, not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet, undeniable truth that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. Ryan felt it before he fully understood it. The shift from control to exposure, from certainty to something far more fragile, because the man standing in front of him did not raise his voice, did not issue threats, did not need to assert anything beyond his presence. And yet everything about the situation had already changed, the weight of it pressing down in a way that could not be ignored. And for the first time since the encounter began, Ryan's focus fractured completely, no longer locked on Angela, no longer anchored in his own narrative, but pulled into a reality he had not prepared for. And the man's gaze remained steady, not hostile, not emotional, simply observant, as if measuring the moment not by what was said, but by what had already been done, and that made it harder, because there was no argument to push against, no escalation to match, only a calm that reflected everything back at him. And Ryan shifted slightly, his stance adjusting, his shoulders no longer squared with the same confidence, because something inside him was beginning to recognize what the crowd had already started to see, that this was no longer a situation he controlled, and Angela stood just behind that line, still composed, still silent. But now her silence carried a different meaning, no longer misunderstood, no longer dismissed, but understood as restraint, as choice. And that realization spread through the people watching, because what had once looked like vulnerability now revealed itself as something far more powerful, something deliberate, something that had never needed to fight to prove its place. And the man finally took one more step forward, closing the remaining distance just enough to define the space between them. And when he spoke again, his voice remained even, but there was a clarity in it now that cut through everything else. "Let us be precise," he said, not as a challenge, but as a correction, and Ryan blinked, the words catching him slightly off guard, because they did not follow the expected pattern of confrontation. They redirected it entirely, and the man continued, "You have made assumptions, you have acted on them, and now you are standing in the result of that decision." And each part of that sentence landed with quiet certainty, not exaggerated, not emotional, but undeniable. And Ryan opened his mouth again, the instinct to respond still there, still pushing forward, but it collided with something else now, something that slowed it down, that forced him to consider before speaking, and that hesitation, small but visible, echoed through the crowd, because authority does not hesitate unless it has reason to. And for the first time, the roles in the moment began to reverse, not dramatically, not with a sudden shift, but gradually, like a tide turning beneath the surface. And Angela took a small breath, barely noticeable, her eyes moving briefly from Ryan to the man beside him. And in that glance there was no fear, no urgency, only confirmation, as if everything unfolding was exactly as it should be. And somewhere behind the crowd, a voice whispered, "Who is that?" But no one answered, because no one needed to. The answer was already forming in the space between actions, in the way the man stood, in the way others around him remained alert without being instructed, in the way the moment itself had realigned around his presence. And Ryan felt it fully now, not as confusion, but as realization, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what has already happened, the kind that forces a person to look back at their own actions with a clarity they did not have before. And his voice, when it came again, was quieter, not because he chose it to be, but because it could not hold the same weight as before. "Sir, I was just following procedure," he said, and the words lingered in the air, but they did not carry the authority they once might have, Because procedure without judgment reveals itself differently when seen from the outside. And the man regarded him for a moment, not dismissing him, not accepting the explanation, simply acknowledging it. And then he spoke once more, the calm never leaving his tone. Procedure does not replace responsibility. And that sentence settled over the scene with a finality that no one could ignore, because it did not argue, it defined. And in that definition, the moment reached a new level of clarity, one that could not be undone, one that made it impossible for anyone watching, including Ryan, to pretend that this was still just another routine encounter. The words settled into the space like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or softened. And for a moment no one moved. Not the crowd, not the man in the suit, not even Angela, because the truth had already been placed in the open and there was nothing left to hide behind. And Officer Ryan Cole felt it fully now, not just as pressure but as exposure, the kind that strips away the certainty he had relied on and replaces it with something far less comfortable, something that forced him to see the moment from the outside instead of from within his own assumptions. And his eyes shifted, not with authority anymore, but with calculation, as if searching for something to hold on to, something that could restore the balance he had lost. But there was nothing, because the balance had never been his to control in the first place. And Angela Brooks remained exactly where she was, her posture still calm, her expression unchanged. But now there was no misunderstanding left in the way people saw her, no confusion about her silence or her restraint, because it had become clear that she had never been waiting to react. She had been waiting for the moment to reveal itself, and that moment had arrived. And the man standing beside her turned slightly, his attention moving from Ryan to the crowd, not to address them, not to acknowledge them, but simply to observe, to register the presence of witnesses, of phones still recording, of a scene that had already extended beyond this park and into something larger, something that would not disappear once it ended. And then, without raising his voice, without any dramatic shift in tone, he spoke again. "Before we go any further," he said, his words measured, deliberate, "it would be appropriate for you to understand exactly who you are speaking to." And the sentence did not rush, it did not force itself forward. It unfolded with a quiet precision that drew every ounce of attention toward it. And Ryan's shoulders stiffened slightly, not in defiance, but in anticipation, because something in that statement carried a weight he could not ignore. And for the first time since the encounter began, he did not interrupt, did not push back. He simply waited, and that alone signaled the complete shift in power that had been building from the very beginning. And Angela took a small step forward, not to confront, not to dominate, but to stand beside the man who had arrived. Her presence now aligned with his in a way that made everything clear without needing explanation. And when she spoke, her voice was as calm as it had been from the start. But now it carried something more, something that no longer needed to remain hidden. "Officer," she said, her tone steady, "this is Governor Daniel Brooks." And the name landed with a weight that rippled instantly through the crowd. Whispers rising, eyes widening, phones adjusting as people tried to capture the moment more clearly, because recognition moved quickly, faster than explanation, faster than denial. And Ryan's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough for the shift to be undeniable, enough for the realization to take hold in a way that could not be reversed. And before he could respond, before he could attempt to reshape the situation with new words, Angela continued, her gaze steady, her voice unwavering, "And I am his wife." And that was the moment everything stopped, not physically, not in sound, but in understanding. Because the narrative that had driven the entire encounter collapsed instantly under the weight of that truth. And Ryan stood there, the space around him no longer his to command. The assumptions he had acted on now fully exposed for what they were, and the crowd felt it. That sharp shift from uncertainty to clarity, from tension to realization. And the man, Governor Brooks, did not step forward again, did not escalate, did not need to, because the moment had already done the work for him. The truth had already reshaped everything. And all that remained now was what came next, not in reaction, not in anger, but in consequence, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with realization, with the kind of understanding that arrives all at once and leaves no room for interpretation. And Officer Ryan Cole stood in the center of it, no longer the one directing the moment, but the one defined by it, his posture tightening slightly as the weight of Angela's words settled in. Not just the name, not just the title, but everything that came with it, everything that reframed the last several minutes into something entirely different. And the crowd reacted in waves, whispers rising, some stepping back as if distance could separate them from what they had just witnessed, others leaning forward, phones steady, capturing every second because this was no longer just an uncomfortable encounter. It had become something far more significant, something that would travel beyond this park, beyond this afternoon. And Governor Daniel Brooks remained composed, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady as it returned to Ryan, not with anger, not with hostility, but with a clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand where the moment now stood. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority, but now it was unmistakable, grounded not just in presence, but in position. "Officer," he said, "this situation will be reviewed in full." And the sentence was simple, but it carried a finality that settled deeper than any raised voice could have, because it was not a reaction, it was a decision. And Ryan swallowed again, the movement more visible now, his confidence no longer masking the reality he was facing, because procedure could not shield him here, not when the entire sequence of events had unfolded in front of witnesses, not when the narrative he had built had been dismantled so completely. And he attempted to speak, to respond, to find something that could stabilize the moment. "Sir, I did not realize." But the words faltered, because realization was no longer the issue. And even he seemed to understand that before finishing the sentence. And Angela watched quietly, her expression still composed. But now there was something else in her gaze, not satisfaction, not triumph, but something deeper, something rooted in truth. Because this was never about who she was connected to. It was about how she had been treated before. That truth was known, and that distinction lingered in the air, powerful, undeniable. And Governor Brooks turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence beside him. And in that small gesture there was a quiet unity, a shared understanding that required no explanation. And then he looked back at Ryan, his tone unchanged. "What matters is not what you knew," he said. "It is what you chose to assume." And that sentence settled over the scene with a clarity that cut through everything else, because it reframed the entire encounter into something simple, something that could not be avoided or redirected. And Ryan lowered his gaze for just a moment, a brief break in eye contact that spoke louder than any response he could have given. And around them the crowd had gone almost completely silent now, not out of instruction, but out of awareness, because they were witnessing something that extended beyond the individuals involved, something that reflected a larger truth, one that did not require explanation to be understood. And the suited man who had stepped out of the vehicle earlier moved slightly closer, his posture attentive but controlled, as if ready to act if needed, though nothing in the moment required force, because everything was already unfolding exactly as it would, through presence, through truth, through the quiet dismantling of assumption. And Angela finally took a small step forward, her voice calm as she spoke again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that reached everyone standing there. "You did not need to know who I was," she said, her eyes steady on Ryan, "to treat me with respect." And that sentence landed with a weight that no title could match, because it stripped everything back to its simplest form, removing the layers of authority, of position, of identity, and leaving only the truth of the moment behind. And in that truth, there was no defense, no justification, no way to reshape what had already been revealed. And as the seconds passed, the reality of what had happened settled into place, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a quiet, undeniable finality that would not fade once this moment ended. The moment did not end with noise. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, like a truth that had finally found its place and refused to move. And no one in the park returned to what they had been doing before, not immediately, because moments like this do not simply pass. They linger, they reshape the space around them. And Officer Ryan Cole stood there with that weight resting squarely on his shoulders, no longer shielded by assumption, no longer supported by the certainty he had carried into the encounter, because everything that had happened now existed outside of him, reflected in the eyes of the crowd, recorded in the devices still pointed in his direction, and more importantly, defined by the words that could not be undone. And he straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority, but as if trying to hold on to what remained of his composure, his voice quieter now, measured in a way that suggested awareness rather than control. "I understand," he said, though the words felt incomplete even as they left him, because understanding after the fact does not change the fact itself. And Governor Daniel Brooks regarded him for a moment, not dismissing him, not engaging further, simply acknowledging that the moment had already reached its conclusion, and that whatever came next would not happen here, not in this park, not in front of this crowd, but beyond it, where actions are examined without the distortion of assumption. And Angela Brooks stood beside him, her presence unchanged, her calm intact, but now it carried something different, something that extended beyond the situation itself, because she had not needed to raise her voice, had not needed to assert anything beyond her dignity. And yet the entire moment had shifted around that, had revealed itself because of it. And she took a small breath, her gaze moving briefly across the people who had gathered, meeting a few eyes, not in accusation, not in expectation, but in quiet acknowledgement, because they had witnessed something real, something that did not belong to a script or a performance, but to a truth that exists whether people choose to see it or not. And as the tension finally began to ease, subtle at first, like the slow release of pressure, the sounds of the park returned, distant voices, footsteps, the rustle of leaves, but they felt different now, as if everything had been slightly altered by what had just taken place. And the suited man stepped forward again, speaking quietly to the governor, his words not meant for the crowd, but his presence signaling that the moment was moving forward, that the next steps were already in motion. And Ryan remained where he was, not stopped, not restrained, but held in place by the understanding that this was no longer something he could walk away from unchanged. And Angela turned slightly, her voice soft but clear as she spoke one final time, not just to him, but to the moment itself. "Respect should never depend on recognition," she said, and the sentence carried beyond the space between them, settling into the air with a weight that felt both simple and absolute. And no one responded, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing that needed to be added. And as Angela and Governor Brooks began to move toward the waiting vehicle, unhurried, composed, the crowd parted naturally, not out of instruction, but out of understanding. And the scene closed not with confrontation, not with resolution spoken aloud, but with something far more lasting, a quiet reminder that power does not define what is right. It reveals who chooses to act with it. And on that afternoon, in a place meant for peace, the truth did not arrive loudly. It arrived through silence, through patience, and through a single moment that showed everyone watching exactly what justice looks like when it does not need to announce itself.